Today's video is sponsored by Wren, a very cool new sponsor that is helping you discover what your carbon footprint is. Wren is a website focused on the effects of climate change and how we can all individually help to do something about it. So you head on over to their website, you go through a quick free questionnaire about what your consumption habits are. We're talking questions like how often do you shop online, how many times per week do you eat red meat. It all takes about 5 minutes, and when you're done, they've got lots of handy information and graphs that put your carbon footprint into perspective. But Wren doesn't just stop there. They're not like, look at you, now you feel super guilty. What they do is they're constantly scouring the globe for reforestation efforts and carbon capture projects that they want to help. And if you're so inclined, you can help too. After you've determined your carbon footprint, you can choose to donate a monthly sum that will offset your own footprint by helping to fund some of these environmental projects. And once you've made a financial commitment, you can begin receiving a monthly update centered around rainforest protection, tree planting initiatives, and carbon capture projects. Look, Wren knows that it's going to take a lot of work to address climate change, but it's easier when we all contribute a little bit towards it. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in checking out, you can head to wren.co or use my referral link in the description box below. And as a special partnership between Wren and me, we're going to plant 10 extra trees for the first 100 people who sign up using the referral link below. Excellent. And now today's video. If you are a fan of films based on theme park rides, you may be familiar with today's destination, Port Royal, Jamaica, the unofficial capital of the Pirates of the Caribbean in the second half of the 17th century. The films I'm referring to, however, take place after 1720, when the fame of Port Royal as a pirate den and wickedest city in the Americas had already waned. The franchise also missed the most interesting chapters of Port Royal's history, how it became the base of operations for the dreaded Buccaneers, and how a devastating earthquake destroyed in barely 3 minutes all of the wealth they had built. The first dwellers of the town known as Port Royal were Jamaica's early inhabitants, the Tainos. They had named the town Cagway or Cagway and used it as a small fishing port. And it could have remained as such if it weren't for Christopher Columbus, who declared Jamaica to be the fairest island eyes have beheld. His positive review of the place convinced his Spanish patrons to take possession of the island as one of their first American colonies. The Spanish also seized the small Cagway from Taino control, but did not invest much in developing the original port. The future and fortune of Jamaica changed drastically in 1654. This is when Oliver Cromwell sent an expedition to the Caribbean under General Robert Venables and Admiral William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. Their mission to capture from the Spanish the island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti. In April of that year, Penn and Venables invaded Hispaniola with 8,000 men, soon losing almost 3,000 to torrential rain, disease, inhospitable terrain, and, most likely of all, pesky Spaniards ambushing them with pikes and muskets. The two senior officers left Hispaniola in haste, but fearing to return to Cromwell empty-handed, decided to invade Jamaica instead, which was less populated, less developed, and less defended. In fact, the English captured Jamaica in about a week, although a sizable number of Spanish soldiers retreated to the interior, where they would wage a long guerrilla campaign. Penn found that the waters near Cagway were a good mooring point for his ships, and Venables erected Fort Cromwell on the shore to protect the harbour. Thus, the settlement of Point Cagway began to develop. Back in London, Cromwell encouraged colonists to relocate to Jamaica, either from the motherland or from other English possessions in the Caribbean, Bermuda, and Barbados. From 1655 to 1661, Port Cagway became the main entry point for some 12,000 settlers. You had Quakers from Barbados, experts in growing tobacco, Dutch Jews expelled from Brazil, skilled at planting sugarcane, 1,000 pre-teen Irish boys sent as indentured servants after Cromwell's invasion of Ireland, and hundreds of vagabonds and robbers transported by the sheriffs of Scotland. Sadly, almost 9,000 of them died in the very first years from their arrival, ravaged by disease and malnutrition. The survivors were also keenly aware of living deep into a Spanish colonial area under threat from seaborne invasions, as well as the ongoing guerrilla attacks. Colonial Governor Edward de Olle successfully repelled 2 Spanish invasions in 1657 and 1658, a victory which also dispatched the remaining guerrillas. De Olle had control of the islands militarily, but for how long? He certainly did not have enough skilled manpower to arm a navy of his own in Port Cagway, but he could certainly hire one. Doyle knew exactly whom to call: the Brethren of the Coast. Back in the day, Spanish vessels and colonial settlements were constantly harassed by the Brethren of the Coast, the buccaneers who operated from the island of Tortuga. We've already covered Tortuga and the buccaneers in a separate video, which I'd encourage you to watch because it has one of the best dad jokes in history in it. But in case you're not in the mood, well, here's a quick summary. The buccaneers were originally a community of French, Dutch, English, and Welsh hunters and traders operating in Hispaniola. After realizing that piracy was a more profitable enterprise, they took to attacking Spanish vessels with little more than a few canoes and a handful of muskets. After the Spanish drove them out from Hispaniola in the early 1630s, these buccaneers relocated to the nearby French colony of Tortuga. In 1642, Governor Jean le Vasseur formalized the practice of issuing letters of marque to the buccaneers. This is when the hunters-turned-pirates became fully fledged privateers, a mercenary force plundering Spanish booty on behalf of the French crown. Their ranks were swelled by veterans of the 30 Years' War, which improved piratical practice with military tactics and discipline. Far from the ragtag, motley crews portrayed in popular fiction, the buccaneers and their brethren were often better trained and equipped than Spanish regular forces. A buccaneer vessel may have been smaller than its quarries, and surely it carried less guns, but it was faster and more maneuverable, allowing raiders to close close to their targets. A typical attack would start with a devastating salvo of cannon and musket fire, dispatching the enemy helmsman and damaging the sails. Next, the buccaneers launched some grappling hooks from the stern of their sloop or schooner and proceeded to board. Again, Hollywood taught us that pirates of the Caribbean dealt with their foes in protracted and spectacular duels, cutlasses drawn and maybe a dagger between the teeth. But the buccaneers' favorite weapon was the simple and devastatingly effective hand grenade. After returning to port, captains proceeded to share their booty in equal parts with their men, strictly abiding to pre-drawn-up contracts. These agreements included provision for those who had suffered severe wounds. For example, your stereotypical pirate with an eye patch and a hook for a hand would have received a total of 700 pieces of 8, or Spanish dollars, for his injuries. So what did they do with all that money? Well, some capable captains would reinvest their funds in weapons, provisions, or larger vessels. Some sensible crewmen would set something aside for their retirement. There are also some rare accounts of buried treasure, but the majority of the stolen hoards went into what mattered the most to these guys: booze, tobacco, and prostitutes. When Doyle invited the buccaneers and other pirates to Port Royal, he enticed them with the promise of letters of marque. They could rob the Spaniards as much as they liked, provided they left English ships alone. The sea rovers obliged and flocked to their new piratical den. Of course, they brought along their old habits and lifestyle. In a matter of a few years, Port Royal had built a solid reputation for being the wickedest city in the Americas, the Sodom of the New World. It is said that 1 in 4 buildings in town was either a tavern, a gambling den, or a brothel. At 6,000 inhabitants, Port Royal was not exactly a metropolis, but its economy flourished thanks to the effects of piracy. Raiders returned into port with pockets full of cash, which they happily poured into the coffers of innkeepers and brothel madams. Some of these pirates were known to spend 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of 8 per night. In turn, they used these earnings to buy new supplies, refurbish establishments, or erect new buildings. Demand for logwood, sugar, and alcohol boomed, and traders of these commodities were quick to supply them. They were soon followed by another type of import: slaves from Africa. It is thus that by the early 1660s, Port Cagway had become a hub for some of the most despicable trades known to mankind: state-sanctioned robbery and murder, and mass kidnapping of entire populations. It's no small wonder, years later, Reverend Emmanuel Heath described the dwellers of Port Royal as the most ungodly and debauched people. In 1661, Jamaican colonists learned that Cromwell had fallen and the monarchy had been restored under Charles II. Port Cagway then received its current name, Port Royal. This rebranding exercise did not change the core business of the harbour, which greatly worried Governor Doyle. As buccaneers enjoyed one success after the other, honest planters and colonists decided to swap their ploughs for cutlasses. In 1665, the Second Anglo-Dutch War broke out, which pitted England against the Dutch Republic and France. This was music to the ears of the Jamaican privateers, as they had more targets for their raids. The war ended in 1667, but was followed by an undeclared conflict against the French colonies in the Caribbean. As a result, English-funded buccaneers from Port Royal were sent on expeditions against French-funded buccaneers from Tortuga. A pirate-on-pirate battle in the Caribbean sounds awesome, cinematically speaking, but it probably never took place. Bound by a brotherhood beyond political barriers, buccaneers from all sides met in secret in Isla de la Vaca, halfway between Tortuga and Jamaica. From there, they planned joint raids against merchant ships of any flag. This period saw the emergence of a legendary figure, Sir Henry Morgan, one of the most successful privateers at Port Royal. His services were held in such esteem that in 1675 he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. As such, he led a crackdown against overt piracy, that is, those raiders who did not hold official letters of marque. So, maybe there were pirate versus pirate duels after all. Port Royal continued to grow, becoming the busiest and most successful harbour in English America. In 1688, for example, its maritime commercial traffic peaked at 213 ships, beating both Bermuda and Barbados. But could an economy so largely based on exploitation and warfare actually be sustainable? Well, we'd never know. 4 years later, the city would be stricken by a catastrophe of biblical proportions. On the morning of the 7th of June, 1692, the Reverend Dr. Emmanuel Heath conducted his morning prayers at St. Paul's Church before joining his friend John White, acting governor of Jamaica. Sitting at a nearby tavern, the two shared a bottle of wormwood wine and then lit their pipes. At about 11:40 a.m., Heath noticed that the ground was moving under his feet. White commented, "It is an earthquake. Be not afraid. It will soon be over." Jamaica was indeed prone to tremors, but none of them had been cause for concern on previous occasions. But this time, White's judgment proved to be the understatement of the century. Almost immediately, the two friends heard the steeple of St. Paul as it collapsed to the ground. As they ran outside in terror, they witnessed the earth opening up and swallowing a multitude of townsfolk. As tremors grew stronger, houses began to crumble. The major forts of the town, the mighty Fort James, Fort Carlisle, and Fort Rupert, sunk underground in a matter of minutes. At the same time, many of the private homes and businesses were quickly sliding into the sea. The ground opened at Port Royal, where I dwell, with a shake, and swallowed whole houses. The shake opened the earth. The water flew up and carried the people in quick. I lost my wife, my son, apprentice, a white maid, and 6 slaves, and all that I ever had in the world. The destruction did not spare those who were already dead. The town cemetery was dragged underwater, with tombstones, caskets, memorials trapped in a maelstrom of unforgiving surf. Skeletons and decomposed bodies, wrenched from their final resting place, appeared on the surface, floating by the newly dead. Eventually, more than half of Port Royal sank into the harbour, destined to remain forever under 20 feet of water. And unbeknownst to Heath and White, the earthquake was causing another terrifying consequence far from dry land. The sea was withdrawing as far as 1 mile away from the coast. And then the waters returned, rushing back towards the shoreline in a 6-foot-high wave. Maybe not an impressive height by tsunami standards, but this surge carried enough volume and energy to sweep inland, leveling houses and human beings in its path. But most of the damage that day had been dealt by a process known as liquefaction. This happens when earthquakes strike sandy grounds already saturated with water. The tremors cause water pressure to increase, which in turn separates the sand particles. Soon the terrain becomes a sludge similar to quicksand. For liquefaction to have taken place, the Port Royal earthquakes may have had a magnitude of 7.5 or higher. Those buildings who remained standing after the 7th of June eventually fell to the numerous aftershocks that battered the town in the ensuing days. Between 1,500 and 2,000 inhabitants died during those 3 minutes of agony, of whom up to 700 were African slaves. Some of the victims were crushed under falling masonry, others drowned when the rising waters flooded the streets. Many more were simply sucked into the ground where the soil liquefied. And those were the lucky ones. Some citizens were caught only halfway down when the earth stopped shaking. They were trapped in the ground, chest high, with watery sand pressing around their shoulders, sides, and diaphragms. Then, the ground around their bodies regained firmness, gripping them like a slowly clenching fist. Gradually, knowingly, They must have gasped for precious air, while they realized their lungs could not expand anymore. The cruelest of buccaneers could not have devised a more refined torture for his victims, one designed to squeeze their lives out to the very last breath. The vicious means of execution by catastrophe, however, did spare at least one lucky soul. This was Mr. Louis Galdy, a French Protestant who had relocated to the Caribbean. According to contemporary sources, including his gravestone, he was swallowed up by the great earthquake and by the providence of God was by another shock thrown into the sea. The resourceful Galdy remained afloat until the boat saved him. The lucky Frenchman lived another 47 years working as a cocoa merchant, pirate hunter, and slave trader until the ripe old age of 80. The ground had shaken for just about 3 minutes. 180 seconds of panic and mayhem had been enough to level one of the wealthiest English colonies. At about 11:43 a.m., the earth had stopped rattling, but the ordeal was not over for the colonists. First came the looting, only natural in a place where the violent seizure of property was encouraged by authorities. One inhabitant wrote, "Your heart would abhor to hear of the depredations, robberies, and violence that were in an instant committed upon the place by the vilest and basest of the people. They that were the strongest and most wicked seized what they pleased." In the following weeks, survivors were stricken by infectious diseases fueled by malnutrition and decomposing bodies. A further 2,000 people died in the epidemic, including acting Governor White. His good friend, Reverend Heath, survived. He later wrote that the earthquake had been an act of God, a cataclysm sent by the Almighty to punish the wicked ways of the inhabitants of Port Royal, pirates, slave traders, and other heathens congregating in houses of ill repute. This narrative became common both in the colonies and in mainland Britain. The Sodom of the Americas deserved to be obliterated with an act of divine intervention. Other contemporary authors were not so biblically inclined, and they recognized that the earthquake was, of course, just a natural phenomenon. No scholar at that time could be aware that Jamaica sits on the Gonave Microplate, separating the Caribbean and North American plates, and this is what makes it so prone to tremors. Colonists, though, knew very well that the ground took to shaking quite often on the islands, and there wasn't anything special about it, just another earthly occurrence. But previous earthquakes simply had not been as intense as the one in 1692, and its effects had been made worse not by the sins of the Port Royal folk, but by their poor planning and construction practices. Most of the town had been built on poor foundations, a patch of water-saturated sand and gravel connected to the mainland by a thin tombolo or strip of land. The previous Taino and Spanish settlers had taken care to erect small wooden buildings no more than 1 story tall. Moreover, they had taken the care of anchoring them with long wooden stakes planted firmly into the ground. Until the 1660s, British colonists had followed roughly the same building principles, but from the 1670s onwards, they found that they needed more real estate to accommodate a thriving community. Unable to extend beyond the 53 acres of Port Royal's surface, they expanded vertically, and as a result of their increased wealth, inhabitants replaced wood with bricks, reflecting the architecture in vogue in the motherland. Thus, on the eve of the earthquake, population density in Port Royal reached levels similar to central London in the 1930s, 150 inhabitants per acre, densely packed in tall brick houses resting on flimsy foundation of loose sand. This was, in other words, a structural cataclysm in waiting. As the townsfolk invested in cementing their status, wealth, and position, they were only accentuating the very fragility of the world that they had built. The disaster did not immediately put an end to the wicked ways of Port Royal. For another 50 years, buccaneers and other privateers continued to visit its harbour. For example, Jack Rackham, also known as Calico Jack, was known to operate here in the early 18th century, and it was also in Port Royal that he met his fate, hanging from the gallows by order of pirate hunter Woodes Rogers. But the pirate den never recovered to its former glory. Nearby Kingston gradually became Jamaica's most important trading and political centre. At the same time, the ever-increasing presence of official naval forces in the Caribbean put an end to the golden age of privateering. The Royal Navy, in fact, established an important base in Port Royal, one where a certain Horatio Nelson would receive early training as an officer. Nonetheless, Port Royal seemed destined to be ravaged by catastrophes on a regular basis. In 1704, for example, it was burned by a fire. In the following 200 years, it was hit by countless hurricanes. One of these, in 1722, sunk the Ranger, the ship of legendary pirate Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart. Then, on the 14th of January 1907, a second devastating earthquake inflicted more destruction upon Kingston and the unfortunate Port Royal, claiming 1,200 victims. What was once one of the largest and busiest port cities of the Caribbean is today a small village at the mouth of Kingston Harbour. But Port Royal refuses to be overshadowed by the neighbouring capital. Since 1999, it has been designated as a National Heritage Site, and the town has filled an application to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well. As mentioned, one of the consequences of the 1692 quake was for most of the city to simply slide underwater. While the ruins of the old pirate den are still there, eerily preserved under several feet of water, salt and silence, hundreds of buildings and shipwrecks lie on sand and silt, a real treasure trove for authorized divers and archaeologists, a sort of Pompeii of the Caribbean, if you like. Since the 1950s, such researchers have explored the submerged city, cataloguing artifacts, shedding light on pirate life and the history of colonial Jamaica. Among many artifacts, archaeologists found delicate earthenware, apothecary bottles, a chamber pot elegantly glazed in green, and a tortoiseshell comb case emblazoned with Henry Morgan's crest. But the most famous piece is probably a pocket watch found by explorer Edward Link in 1969. The watch was manufactured in 1686, and its owner still carried it on that fateful 7th of June 1692, when the earth started to shake. As the port violently slid into the sea, so did the pocket watch and its unlucky carrier. As he and hundreds of compatriots met their sudden fate, so did that watch. Its hands are now forever frozen at the exact time of 1143, a perennial reminder of the fragile existence of an entire city. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.